Morning. I'm going to get into a sermon that I've entitled Change Agent. John chapter 2, we're going to look at verses 1 through 11 this morning. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding as well. I just want to say welcome to those of you who are joining us online this morning. We are indeed creatures of habit. Some of us more than others, but we like our routines. We are creatures of habit. We don't like change very much. Going to a restaurant, if I've been to that restaurant, if I've been there before, somebody will come out to me, a waiter or waitress. They will bring me a menu. I will look like I'm reading it. I will open it up, and I will order the same thing that I ordered the time before. That's the way that it goes. I like what I like, and I don't like what I don't like. There you go. Buying our groceries. We know, if you've been in that store before, you know what aisles you're going to go down. So you walk in, and this is our thing about Walmart, right? Every Walmart, I heard an amen, but every Walmart seems to be arranged differently. You know, the cereal is in this section in this Walmart, but it's in this section. I don't know what I'm going to get when I walk in there, right? I like to know where things are. Because honestly, if people weren't in there and this was like supermarket sweep, I could get in and make an athletic event of it. I could get all my shopping done in 10 minutes if there weren't slow people walking down the aisles. I could just get my stuff because I know where it's at. I like to know where things are. The routes that we drive to and from work, to and from church, to and from school, well, we tend to take the same routes, don't we? This is always one of those things that we talk about in military and intelligence communities of like changing up our routes a little bit because we become easy targets by taking the same way to and from all the time. And even when we say we need a change, we're okay with that change because it was our idea. I need a change. I need a change. But because it was our idea, we're okay with it. But if it was somebody else's idea, we wouldn't be okay with it. And sometimes in church, we say we want change until somebody changes something that we liked. We say we want change. We want the results to be different, but not the ingredients. We want change. And don't get me wrong, not all changes are good changes. But history has shown that people and organizations that don't change do die. That is a truth of history. Habits can be really good things. 21 days to establish a new habit. But they can also become idols for worship. So you want to know if something is an idol? Stop doing it and see if you have withdrawal symptoms. Stop doing it and see if you have withdrawal symptoms. Even with Jesus, we want him to change us. But not that part. Not that thing. Jesus changed us, but just a little circle around those things. Don't change those things. The question that the text answers this morning is, what does Jesus change? How does Jesus bring about change? And how much of it does Jesus change? In verses 1 and 2, we see this wedding celebration. The gospel writer records these events as happening on the third day. That is a clue for us to know that the scene has changed. Remember, on day 1 of Jesus' public ministry, John the Baptist has his first real-life encounter with Jesus. And he sees him in the flesh, and he cries out in verse 29 of chapter 1, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." That's day number 1. And later that same day, there's the anonymous disciple, there's Andrew, and there's Simon Peter. They become followers of Jesus. That's day number 1. Day number 2, we see Philip and Nathanael become followers of Christ. And the skeptic Nathanael is turned into a confessing believer when he says, "You are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." And so now, we see in the opening verse of chapter 2, we find ourselves on day 3 of Jesus' public ministry, and the setting is Cana of Galilee. We've got a little bit of a map here for you to look out. And I just want you to see the relationship of Cana up to the north and Jerusalem to the south. Quite a bit of distance. And also notice the relationship of Cana to Nazareth. It was right there. The modern location would be called Kirbet Cana, which is about 9 miles north of Nazareth. Cana was not really noteworthy for any particular reason other than it establishes the first signpost in Jesus' ministry. That's why it's famous, not for anything else other than Jesus did his first miracle here in Cana. More important than Cana as a geography is the wedding as a setting here. Oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, Adam and Eve didn't have a wedding, so why have a wedding? Genesis 2:24 says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. We see that there. And what God has joined, let no man tear apart. What we see is this idea of covenant marriage. But what about a wedding? The marriage ceremony is a public profession of a covenant love. A wedding is simply the party that celebrates that commitment. Marriage, the marriage ceremony, needs at least 3 participants. It needs a man, it needs a woman, and it needs God. The wedding celebration can have as many as you can feed. The wedding celebration developed over time as a man-made invention. But let's be clear that a marriage covenant, one man, one woman, joined together for a lifetime, that's God's idea. That's God's idea. And yet, even though the wedding celebration is something of a man-made tradition, we see Jesus here attending such a celebration. He didn't flip over tables in the temple. He didn't decry this as some kind of extra-biblical celebration. No, Jesus came as a guest. And he leaves some implicit endorsement on the concept of a wedding by doing so. In addition to Jesus, we see a few other characters presented here. We see Jesus' mother. We see his disciples. We see the wedding, which includes a bride and a groom. And it was common for those who were scholars in that day, those people who had some kind of, they were public figures, to be invited to a wedding. I.e., if one of your favorite athletes came to your wedding, that would be a big deal. It'd almost be a stamp of approval. That's the idea here. So Jesus may have been invited because he was a prominent figure. But what's more probable here is that this was a wedding for a close friend or family member. The fact that Jesus' mother himself and his disciples received invitations to this seems to suggest that. And the fact that Jesus' mother ends up bearing some kind of a burden for solving the problem that we're going to read about here in a few seconds, the fact that she has some kind of problem-solving relationship in this whole thing helps us to see this was probably a wedding for somebody that they knew. So, parenthetical to the text, why does the author say Jesus' mother? Why not simply say Mary? Why does it say his disciples? Why not mention them by name? And what about the bride and the groom? Do we even know who this wedding is for? Mary is never named in the Gospel of John. The bride and the groom are never named. The disciples are never specified in this encounter. Rather than referring to them by the name given by their parents, he refers to them by their relationship to Jesus. It's not Mary, it's Jesus' mother. It's not Andrew, Peter, Philip, and Nathaniel, it's Jesus' disciples. When all of the dust settles, hear me on this, when all of the dust settles, the only thing that matters is your relationship to Jesus. That's it. That's the only thing that matters. One day, we will stand before him, and he will either say, well done, good and faithful servant, or he will say, depart from me, I never knew you. I used to watch this show on TV called Bridezilla. How many people have watched Bridezilla? You can confess. Okay, all right. So watch Bridezilla, and what you see in there is this, this whole ecosystem of wedding stuff, right? These weddings are just huge affairs, especially in an American context. And sometimes people act out. That's the whole Bridezilla idea of this. In American weddings have their own traditions. For instance, one of the common traditions is that a bride is supposed to have something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. This is an idea from an old English rhyme that comes from this idea of good luck. Something old represents the couple's past life. Something new represents the couple's future life, happy future. Something borrowed typically means incorporating an item into someone who is already happily married into your marriage, hoping that their good fortune rubs off on you. And blue as a color represents fidelity and love, and so is hence something blue. This idea of carrying a bouquet, It's a very American thing as well. We had peonies and we had calla lilies in Heather's bouquet. Great, gorgeous, one of the best looking bouquets I've ever seen. This, beautiful floral arrangement. But in ancient times, more likely it was going to be spices and herbs that would have been carried in the bouquet. And the whole genesis for this idea was that these spices and herbs would ward off the evil spirits that were present in the place. Bridesmaids wearing matching dresses. Actually, originally, the bridesmaids would have matched the bride. The idea was that if there were evil spirits that were looking to thwart this marriage from being successful, if everybody dressed alike, the evil spirit wouldn't know which one was actually the bride. Bet y'all didn't know that either, huh? And wearing that ring on your finger, this in Roman tradition, supposedly the vein was the closest one to your heart, had a direct line to your heart from this finger. Hence, this becomes the finger that we put our wedding ring on. Now, all of these things have their roots in pagan traditions. I'm still wearing a ring on this finger. Most oftentimes we do things because this is a tradition that has been passed down through your family. It's not because you guys are worshiping evil spirits. I trust that. It was just something that was handed down and you did it. One of the other traditions in American weddings is that we take out a second mortgage to pay for it. Right? We spend tens of thousands of dollars on an event that's going to last 3 hours. Maybe if you're a young couple and your parents aren't paying for the wedding, you forego putting a down payment on a house so that you can pay for this thing. Absolutely absurd, right? So if a college student takes their tuition and goes and throws a keg party, we're like, that's bad. But we take out a second mortgage for this party and that's okay. Oh, you must be a really good father. It's really good. Makes no sense at all, right? Because ultimately the celebration is pointing to something else, and that's the marriage. Here's what we know about first century weddings. They were always accompanied by celebratory feasts. There was always food. In Christian and church circles, there's always food, right? I mean, we just don't do anything. We're not going to have a workshop back there without having food. We're going to have food at everything. We call it fellowship, right? This is just food. Celebratory feasts go with everything. Super important in Jesus' culture. In fact, many rabbis would excuse the wedding party from religious duties because of their obligations to the wedding itself. These wedding celebrations didn't just last for 3 hours. They normally lasted for 7 days. 7 days, a whole week worth of eating and partying, right? This is a Jewish wedding. And these guests were connected socially. In cases of a wealthy family, maybe the entire town would have come. People who disliked the family would have still attended for fear of being socially inappropriate. Man, I really hate that bride, but I'm gonna go to that wedding because I don't want to be the bad guy, right? This is how it would have played out. American weddings put the focus on the bride and the groom. First century Jewish weddings put the focus on the bride's family and the groom's family. They were family affairs. But biblical marriage ceremonies put the focus on God. They put the focus on God. Jesus stepped out of eternity and he is now a guest at a party. And the creator of the universe now resides with his creation. John transitions from Jesus' presence in the world to his work in the world. And his work begins at a wedding. Verses 3 and 4, when the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him, "They don't have any wine." "What has this concern of yours to do with me, woman?" Jesus asked. "My hour has not yet come." One commentator says, in an ancient world, sociologically speaking, the man's world was regarded as the outside world, the public world. The woman's world was regarded as the inside world, the private world. And what we see in a wedding is this mixing of the public and the private. This mixing of the outside world and the inside world coming together in the context of a wedding. And wine in a Mediterranean culture would have been a significant and prominent part of these festivals. And contrary to some church teachings, the wine here was actually an alcoholic wine. But it was not distilled to increase alcoholic content, and normally it was mixed with water, say 2 parts water to 1 part wine. So why would this have been a big deal, running out of wine? Well, because first century weddings weren't just about two people, but about two families. There was a social dynamic that was going on here. There was a relationally intense atmosphere. To run out of wine would have been akin to losing honor or losing status. How many of you have gone to the grocery store before, right? And you've got this whole cart full of groceries, and you put them out on the little conveyor belt. You've got 20 people stacked up behind you. They're getting ready to do their checkout as well. You get all the way up there, gets bagged up, and the lady runs your card, and it's declined. Now, it could have been because you tripped some kind of algorithm that said you were purchasing in an area that's normally not your home, and so for theft protection purposes, they just shut down your card. Your bank did that. It could be because you have no money. In either case, there's this feeling of embarrassment because the lady, checking you out, it's like, hey, this was declined, sir. Do you have another card? Meanwhile, 20 sets of eyes are looking at you, wondering why you're poor and wondering why you're holding up the line. And so here you are, this great feeling of embarrassment, and you're put on the spot. That feeling is really what's happening here. Running out of wine would have been essentially like having your card declined. There's this feeling of public embarrassment and shame that would have happened here. And despite this hospitality faux pas, in almost an assured loss of reputation for the family name, Jesus replies in verse 4, "What has this to do with me, woman?" Now, this verse has been the focus of scrutiny by lots of different interpreters. Jesus uses the term gunai, which means woman. That term doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus was being harsh to his mom. After all, he uses the same term to refer to her when he's hanging on the cross. And yet, it can infer a tone of disrespect. More likely, what we see here is Jesus is placing a little emotional and relational distance between himself and his earthly mother. He was about his heavenly Father's business, and everything else, including his mom's petitions, are a distant second. He says, "What has this concern of yours to do with me?" Literally, it means what to me and to you. It's short, it's terse, and again, gives a distancing response as Jesus feels some sort of implicit expectation on her part to do something about it. Roman Catholics will argue that Mary's so-called persistence here resulted in Jesus' subsequent reaction. In other words, Mary is to be worshipped because she had the gift of nagging. But Raymond Brown, Roman Catholic priest and scholar, argues against Mariology, which is the veneration and worship of Mary, by saying this: in the gospel, Jesus is consistently pictured as responding not to human pressure, but to the direction of God. Such a statement is not a matter of Roman Catholic Protestant debate. It is a matter of what the text means. The focus of this pericope is not on Mary, but on Jesus. So when in the middle of this predicament, Jesus is asked, makes the statement, "We're running out of wine." They don't have any more wine. Have you ever seen somebody that had a certain kind of, they were in a situation, they were in a fix. They had this problem. Maybe they had a flat tire. Maybe they ran out of money. Whatever the case is, they had this predicament. And they turn to you and they say, "What are we going to do about this?" And you're like, "Man, I didn't know this was my problem." All of a sudden, the word "we" was used. What are we going to do about this? I don't know. What are you going to do about it? But this is idea that you're trying to be included into the solution for this problem now. That's essentially what Mary is doing there. They ran out of wine. Hint, hint, like you need to do something about this. That's exactly what's happening here. And the implication is, we expect you to do something about it. The lack of wine was Mary's concern, but not Jesus's. He says, "My hour has not yet come." This hour was when he was going to be crucified. Like, that's the whole purpose in Jesus coming, was to be crucified and to be raised again. That was his mission statement. And this little problem over here, Mother, that's not really in my mission set. That's not what I do. I don't do windows, right? I'm coming to do the cross. That was not his concern. You, Mary, are concerned with this wedding. My mind is on this hour that I'm living towards. This little request of yours doesn't get me further down the road on the mission that my Father sent me on. But, as we'll see, it doesn't deter Jesus from his mission either. And even though the fullness and culmination of his mission was the cross, he still ministered to others leading up to it. That's a note for us as well. We may have a mission, we may have a calling, we may have a thing that God has given us to do, and there may be some other things that kind of seem to get in the way of what God wants us to do. And sometimes we're called to just let those things go and other people to solve those problems. And sometimes we minister to people as we go on the mission that God has given us to do. Distancing and disrespect are two different things. Distancing and disrespect are two different things. Jesus was distancing. He was not disrespecting his mother. Mary was clearly not the point of this story. But then again, neither is the wine and neither is the wedding. The point is Jesus. The problem of wine is met with a miraculous solution here in verse 5. Do whatever he tells you, his mother told the servants. Now 6 stone water jars had been set there for Jewish purification. Each contained 20 or 30 gallons. Fill the jars with water, Jesus told them, and so they filled them to the brim. And then he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the head waiter, and they did. So Jesus made between 120 and 180 gallons of wine. How big was this party, right? How many people were going to be blessed because of this? And notice Jesus didn't even bother to say, I'll help. Mary just assumes that he will, and he does, in fact, help. And he spots 6 stone water jars and tells the servants to fill the jars with water. So for the purposes of a visual, imagine that each one of these jars would have contained about as much water as we would hold in a common bathtub. So Jesus essentially made 6 bathtubs worth of wine. A typical household would have 2 types of jars, clay jars and stone jars. The clay jars hadn't been cured in a kiln, and so they became dirty and they would have to be disposed of. The stone jars, however, on the other hand, would stay clean. Hence, they were used in Jewish purification, stone jars. And so, essentially, what they're saying is, Jesus would have said, take that stone jar, which contains the water, that normally servants would use to wash people's hands before they came into the wedding. I want you to take that, I want you to fill it up, and I want you to just be faithful, fill them all the way up to the top. And Jesus tells them to do exactly that. And as Jesus tells them exactly what to do, they take a sample of this wine to the head waiter in verse 9. And when the head waiter tasted the water after it had become wine, he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And he called the groom and told him, everyone sets out the fine wine first, then, after the people are drunk, the inferior. But you have kept the fine wine until now. How do we know that this was actually a miracle? Well, the master of the banquet verifies that information. This is actually good wine. And while most of the people put out the good stuff first, wait for people to get drunk, and then put out the cheap stuff, Jesus does the opposite. The wine that Jesus made was the good stuff. The stuff not from the bottom shelf, but from the top shelf. And the story continues with the conclusion by the narrator in verse 11. Then Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Jesus changes everything. That's our main idea this morning. Jesus changes everything. The first of his signs, as with all of his signs, is to reveal his glory. The terms signs, wonders, and miracles are all common terms for the miraculous in the Bible. So it says that after Jesus did this, his disciples didn't just believe him, they believed in him. They didn't just believe him, they didn't just take his word for it, they believed in him. The sign revealed his glory, and that glory led to faith. The sign revealed his glory, and that glory led to faith. The miracle performed at the wedding feast, the miracle performed, and the wedding itself are just small props that led to faith. They're small props in the story God's telling that led to faith. C.S. Lewis, in his writings, The Miracles, from the book God in the Dock, he says this: God created the vine and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and with the aid of the sun to turn that water into a juice which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus, every year, from Noah's time until ours, God turns water into wine. That men fail to see. Either like the pagans, they refer the process to some finite spirit. Or like the moderns, they attribute real and ultimate causality to the chemical and other material phenomena, which are all senses we can discover in it. But when Christ at Cana makes water into wine, the mask is off. The miracle only has half of its effect if it convinces us that Christ is God. It will have its full effect when we see a vineyard or drink a glass of wine. We remember, here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. Here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. So back to our original questions. How much does Jesus change? He changes all of it. How does Jesus bring about change? By performing miracles beyond explanation. And what does Jesus change? Everything. He changes everything. There are so many theological implications just oozing out of this text. We see the mission of the Son, mission of Jesus. My hour has not yet come. We see God's timing, that there is an hour that this was going to be performed, and what's happening here is in advance of that. So God has a particular time, and so just a parenthetical note to you, God has His purposes and He has His plans. Don't rush in front of Him and don't lag behind Him. God has a time for everything, His hour. The true master, the true bridegroom. We see the wedding, the bride, the groom, but ultimately, you see, we're pointed to the wedding of Cana is compared to the wedding of God. That Christ, the bridegroom, will return for His bride, the church. So not only are there multiple theological implications, but there are some practical applications as well. The first is that we are to believe in miracles. Believe in miracles. You can't be a Christian if you don't believe in miracles. Jesus died and He was resurrected, the miraculous in the tomb. So if you don't do miracles, you don't do Christian. You have to believe in miracles. Believe in miracles. This miracle was the first of many for Jesus. And like all of those miracles, it reminds us that there is an unseen reality that exists. That the physical world that we see around us isn't all that there is. There is a spirit world. There are things that we cannot physically see, that are not empirically verified. And further, there is a God in whom we are to believe. Miracles happen in everyday life, just like they did here at the wedding, so be in everyday life. Be in everyday life. If you're a recluse, you're not going to allow God to use you in the context of somebody's everyday life. Miracles happen in God providing for everyday bread and everyday needs. So trust that God will provide for your needs and your daily bread, and don't take it for granted when He does. Miracles happen in the daily. Miracles also happen when we become servants. So become a servant of Jesus. Understand how Jesus used servants here to bring the miracles. Jesus gave them 3 commands: to fill, to draw, and to bring. They had no idea how it would turn out. They had no idea what they were doing when He asked for it, but they did it. They likely didn't even know who He was, but they did it instead. Oftentimes our service comes even when we don't know why. Even when we don't know why. And once again, Jesus uses those who are often overlooked, i.e. the servants, and their obedience to facilitate His miracles. He didn't use the head waiter. He didn't use the groom. It was the lowly servants that He used in His grand economy. God uses servants. And their obedience to Jesus in service to their master led to a blessing for their master. Their servants in obedience for their master led to a blessing for their master. Miracles happen in faith, and they lead to faith. Mary had faith. The servants had faith, and ultimately the faith in Jesus' miracle led to a reaffirmation of the disciples' faith. Miracles aren't the focus of the story, but they reveal God's glory. The point of the empty tomb was not the empty tomb. It wasn't even in the defiance of the laws of nature. What made the empty tomb special was the God that walked out of it. Miracles they do not exist. God did not do miracles simply so that they could point to themselves. Miracles point to something else. They are a signpost that points us to God. They point us to Christ, and it's His glory that's revealed. Miracles point to something beyond themselves. They point to Jesus. So, number 2, believe in Jesus. Like, this is a consistent application throughout the book of John. John has written these things so that you might believe. so believe in Jesus. Because Jesus transforms the world and its activities. Jesus transposes the purposes and the plans of humanity with the will and wisdom of the Father. Jesus rescues a failing civilization, a failing celebration into a celebration of God. And Jesus, as the true bridegroom, is making preparations for his bride, the church. Jesus said to Nathanael in chapter 1, "You believed because I saw you under a fig tree. Get ready, buddy. I'm going to do greater things than these." And Jesus, in that very day, turns water into wine. And throughout the book of John, he'll do increasingly greater miracles over and over again until we get to the point where we see angels ascending and descending from heaven. Jesus is doing greater things, so believe in Jesus. Jesus wants to take that thing in your life that you don't think is possible, and he wants to make it possible. He wants to do greater things. Jesus wants to take that thing that you have such a difficult problem with, that need that you don't feel like can be met, and he wants to meet that need. Now, I'm not preaching the prosperity gospel here, but what I am saying is that Jesus has set the bar higher than you even expect. Sometimes you pray prayers and you've already predetermined in your mind that it can't possibly happen. And Jesus says, "I want to do greater things." Pray in faith, believe in faith, because Jesus is going to do greater things. Believe in Jesus, because he changes everything. Now here's the irony of this request by Jesus' mother. Mary petitioned Jesus to intervene in order to save the wedding from embarrassment. But Jesus, by hanging on a cross, had to suffer embarrassment in order to intervene. And don't miss the connection between the jars. The jars that would once provide for ritual purification have now made way for the wine that provides for festival celebration. The ritual is no longer needed. The purification jars are now made useless. The water that was once used for cleansing has now been made into something that is to drink. God is no longer concerned with cleansing externally, but cleansing internally. And the agent of cleansing isn't something that man can draw out of a well, but something made entirely by God, because the physical jar of Jesus is both the basis for our purification and the basis for our celebration. Jesus changes everything.